Chapter 9. Matthew chapter 19, verse 9. An exception for what? Matthew chapter 19, verse 9 is undoubtedly one of the most debated verses concerning remarriage after divorce. Quote, "And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery." End quote. Matthew chapter 19, verse 9. For now, I will put aside the discussion on what Jesus meant by fornication in this passage, as this will be explored in more depth in chapter 12. The main question I will deal with in this chapter is whether the exception for fornication applies to divorce only or to divorce as well as remarriage. In other words, is this passage saying that if your wife commits fornication, you are permitted to divorce her but not remarry, or is it saying that if your wife commits fornication, you are permitted to divorce her and marry another person? If the fornication exception here in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9 applies to remarriage as well as to divorce, it would be the only place in the Bible that explicitly allows remarriage after divorce. And so it's no surprise that this passage has become so important to those holding to the permissive view. It's all Greek to me. One trend I have seen among permissive view teachers is that they imply that if you only knew Greek, you would agree with them that the exception clause applies to remarriage as well as divorce. But since you don't know Greek, and likely never will, you just have to trust them. One such example of this is from Mike Winger in his very popular YouTube video on this subject. Quote, "The most important thing that we all need to understand is the exception not only allows for divorce, it allows for remarriage. There is a lot of debate and discussion on that topic. What I will say is D.A. Carson's commentary on Matthew is helpful here. It evaluates various interpretations and shows why they fail. The short version is this. It fits the Greek well. The exception applies to both the divorce and the remarriage. Both are permitted in the case of a justified divorce." End quote. If you follow the link mentioned by Winger to D.A. Carson's commentary, you will find that Carson himself is far less convinced that the Greek helps his case. Quote, "Though it is formally true that the except clause is syntactically linked to the divorce clause, not the remarriage clause, this is scarcely decisive. Locating the except clause anywhere else would breed even more ambiguity." End quote. In other words, Carson thinks the passage is ambiguous, meaning he thinks it could be read either way, though he will make arguments for why he thinks it supports the permissive view, which we will look at later. Scholars tend to agree with Carson that the Greek in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9 is ambiguous, and that it could technically be read in more than one way. A. Andrew Das says of this, quote, "Matthew chapter 19, verse 9 is the only gospel text that may actually permit remarriage. In this case, the word except for sexual sin would modify both the verbs divorce and remarry, granting an exception to both. Another possibility is that the exception clause may modify only the first verb. Scholars recognize both options as grammatically admissible. Several lines of evidence, however, favor the conclusion that the exception clause modifies only the divorce verb, in which case Matthew chapter 19, verse 9 does not offer any permission for remarriage." End quote. I will go through the various arguments that the permissive view scholars make about the Greek later on, but I first want to make a point that I think is very persuasive for the traditional view regarding the underlying Greek text. Native Koine Greek speakers agree with the traditional view. Koine Greek, the language that the New Testament was written in, is no longer spoken by any native peoples. Koine Greek has many similarities to modern Greek, but there are many differences as well. All of the early church fathers who spoke Koine Greek natively and taught on this passage agree that the exception clause in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9 applied to divorce, but not to remarriage. As Das points out, quote, "Early Christian writers interpreted the exception clause as applying only to the first verb, to divorce, and not to the second, to remarry." End quote. Also, see Chapter 3 about the uniformity of the pre-Nicene Greek church fathers regarding their views on divorce and remarriage, namely that they all believed that Jesus taught that divorce was allowed for fornication, but remarriage was always adultery while the other spouse lived. Think about that. If the native Greek speakers of the early church all agree that this passage is allowing for an exception to divorce but not remarriage, it should make any modern teaching about what the Greek really says immediately suspect. The Greek arguments. I believe that you can understand most of the arguments that the theologians make about the Greek in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, without actually knowing Greek. This is because most of their arguments boil down to things that apply to the English text as well. Both are possible. The core issue is that, just as with the English version of this passage, it's technically possible for both the permissive and traditional interpretations of Matthew chapter 19, verse 9 to be valid. When reading the passage in English, two possible meanings emerge. One, that fornication is an exception for divorce only, and two, that fornication is an exception for both divorce and remarriage. Since both interpretations are technically feasible, we must rely on other criteria to determine which one is correct. One reliable approach is to compare Scripture with Scripture to find clarity. The Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 connection. The passage I would like to bring to your attention for comparison's sake is Matthew chapter 5 verse 32, which is a teaching of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus first establishes his position on remarriage. Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 forms a doublet with Matthew chapter 19 verse 9. A doublet refers to two passages, stories, or sayings that appear to be parallel or closely related but occur in different parts of the text. A. Andrew Das says of this, quote, Matthew chapter 19 verse 9 forms a doublet with chapter 5 verse 32. Doublets are a common feature across the Matthean landscape. For example, chapter 3 verse 2, chapter 4 verse 17, chapter 3 verse 10, chapter 7 verse 19, chapter 13 verse 12, chapter 25 verse 29, and chapter 5 verses 29 and 30, and chapter 18 verses 8 and 9. And the second instance of a doublet usually parallels but sometimes abridges the first in content. End quote. These are also the only two passages where an exception to divorce is mentioned, and so it is very likely that understanding one will help us understand the other. Comparing Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 and Matthew chapter 19 verse 9. Quote, But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery. End quote. Matthew chapter 5 verse 32. Quote, And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. End quote. Matthew chapter 19 verse 9. The exception clause in Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 is agreed to only apply to divorce, and it warns that a man cannot divorce his wife other than because of fornication, or else he would be guilty of causing her to commit adultery, apparently because in that case she would likely get remarried, as was the cultural norm at the time, as it is today. In essence, Jesus is warning of a sin that many people overlook today, which is that causing your wife to commit adultery is equivalent to adultery. For example, if you caused someone to commit murder, steal something, or commit sexual sin, you would be guilty as well, regardless of whether you were the one doing the act itself. Quote, Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks, for it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to that man through whom the stumbling block comes. End quote. Matthew chapter 18 verse 7. Dean Taylor says it this way, quote, Jesus held the man guilty of adultery simply for divorcing his wife, even without remarriage. Jesus said that the man who divorces his wife actually shares in the guilt of the woman's remarriage by causing his wife's future adultery. In reference to the guilt of causing his wife's adultery by sending her away, Jesus gave only one exception, saving for the cause of fornication. Why did Jesus grant this exception? It is very clear. The man was obviously not going to be held guilty of causing his wife to become an adulterer if she was an adulterer already. End quote. Taylor is saying that the exception clause in Matthew chapter 19 verse 9 should be understood as the same concept as Matthew chapter 5 verse 32. Quote, "You can read it in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, as the early church read it, and that is to harmonize it with the Matthew chapter 5, verse 32 account as an exception to the guilt of adultery for divorcing an adulterous wife. With this view, the scripture reads just like Matthew chapter 5, including its blanket prohibition against remarriage." End quote. Interestingly, one of the most prominent and often quoted permissive view scholars on this subject, John Murray, mentions the possibility that this verse is talking about causing one's spouse to commit adultery, and he says the idea that one could cause their spouse to commit adultery, quote, "nonsense," end quote. Quote, "A comparison with Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 will help to clarify this point. There it is said, quote, 'Everyone who puts away his wife except for the cause of fornication makes her to commit adultery,' end quote. In this case, the exceptive clause has full meaning and relevance apart altogether from remarriage on the part of the divorcing husband. This is so because the sin contemplated on the part of the divorcing husband is not the committing of adultery on his part, but the making of his wife to be an adulteress. But in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, the case is entirely different. The burden thought here in chapter 19, verse 9, is the committing of adultery on the part of the divorcing husband himself. But this sin on his part presupposes his remarriage. Consequently, in the syntax of the sentence as it actually is, the meaning and relevance of the exceptive clause cannot be maintained apart from its application to the remarriage as well as to the putting away. But if we do this without reference to the remarriage clause, we get nonsense and untruth, namely, whoever puts away his wife except for fornication commits adultery." End quote. D.A. Carson makes the same point in his commentary, suggesting that the idea of causing your spouse to commit adultery by improperly divorcing them is, quote, "ridiculous," end quote. Quote, "But this wording suggests that fornication is being advanced as the actual reason for marrying another, and not only for the divorce, an interpretation that borders on the ridiculous," end quote. In other words, they are saying that if the exception applies only to divorce, it would ultimately imply that a man can commit adultery simply by divorcing his wife, other than because of fornication, even if he doesn't remarry. Murray finds this concept to be nonsense, and Carson says the notion is ridiculous. However, as we've just discussed, Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 logically leads to this exact conclusion, that if a man divorces his wife for reasons other than fornication, he causes her to commit adultery. And if you cause someone to commit adultery, you are guilty of sin. And Taylor argues, adultery specifically. The only exception to this would be if the wife has already made herself an adulterer through fornication, and thus the husband would not be held liable for her almost inevitable remarriage and adultery in that case. Arguments about word placement. The vast majority of arguments about the Greek in Matthew chapter 19 verse 9 have to do with where the words are placed in the sentence. These arguments can also easily be understood by looking at the English text. I will use the New American Standard Bible for this section to make it even easier to comprehend. According to A. Andrew Das, there are three possible positions where the exception clause could have been placed while still maintaining grammatical correctness. The first position would be after, quote, "whoever," end quote, and before, quote, "divorces," end quote. This placement of the exception would require divorce and remarriage in instances of fornication. 1. Quote, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman, except for immorality, commits adultery," end quote. The second position would be to place the exception clause after the second verb, quote, "and marries another," end quote. This version would clearly permit both divorce and remarriage in instances of a wife's infidelity. 2. Quote, "And I say to you, whoever, except for immorality, divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery," end quote. The third position, the way it actually appears in Matthew chapter 19 verse 9, is between the two verbs. 3. Quote, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for immorality, and marries another woman commits adultery," end quote. Das thinks that the placement of the words in Matthew chapter 19 verse 9 is strong evidence for the traditional view. Quote, The third position is the only place one could position the exception clause in order to modify only the first verb. The placement of the exception clause, therefore, renders more likely that Jesus is permitting an exception only to divorce but not to remarriage." End quote. Dean Taylor quotes a much more emphatic Jacques Dupont about the Greek supporting the traditional view. Quote, Jacques Dupont, speaking on a Greek exegesis of Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, states, "There is only one way of understanding the syntax of chapter 19, verse 9. It is a double conditional clause in which an elliptical phrase is placed immediately after the first condition, to put away. The elliptical phrase, except for immorality, does not contain a verb, and one must be supplied from the context. The only verb that has been stated for the reader to understand is the one immediately preceding the exception clause, put away, the verb Matthew's readers just passed over. Matthew chapter 19, verse 9 would then be read, quote, "If a man puts away his wife, if it is not for immorality that he puts her away and marries another, he commits adultery." End quote. Marriage and Divorce, pages 102 and 103. Dupont says that the exception clause is grammatically connected to the phrase before it and simply acts as a parenthetical clarification to the original question asked by the Pharisees. Quote, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause at all?" End quote. Therefore, just like in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, the exception is from the guilt of divorcing a woman who is already an adulterer. End quote. Conclusion. In our exploration of Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, the central question is whether the exception clause for fornication allows both divorce and remarriage or only divorce. The evidence strongly supports the traditional view that it applies solely to divorce. Early church fathers, native Koine Greek speakers, unanimously agreed that the exception permits divorce but not remarriage, which they viewed as adultery if the original spouse is still living. This consensus should lead us to approach modern permissive interpretations with caution. The connection between Matthew chapter 19, verse 9 and chapter 5, verse 32 further reinforces this. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, Jesus warns that unjust divorce causes adultery, implicating the husband in sin, even without remarriage. Greek text analysis supports the idea that the exception clause modifies only the verb divorces, supporting the traditional view that divorce is permitted in cases of fornication, but remarriage is not. In conclusion, scriptural, linguistic, and historical evidence align to uphold the sanctity of marriage and the gravity of both divorce and remarriage.